Snow fell in a soft but merciless curtain over Central Park that night, smothering benches, branches, and breath alike. The world felt suspended, muffled in white silence. Charles Whitaker, billionaire, heir to one of Manhattan's oldest fortunes, adjusted his tailored coat and quickened his stride along the path. He hated the cold, hated the stillness of winter that reminded him of everything wealth couldn't warm. But that night, the cold wasn't what stopped him. It was a face he had tried and failed to forget. The boy was curled up on a park bench, knees to chest, his frame trembling under a thin gray hoodie. He looked barely alive, pale skin nearly blending with the snow-dusted wood beneath him. Most people would have kept walking. Charles almost did. He always did. But this time, something made him pause. His breath caught. That face, he turned slowly, unable to move forward, unable to look away. In the boy's hands was a photograph, old, torn at the corners, as if it had been carried for years without protection. Charles stepped closer. In the dim, amber glow of the park lamp, he saw what was on the photo. Two boys, one in a crisp blazer, grinning wide with pride. The other, slightly younger, wearing hand-me-downs and standing a step behind. As if unsure whether he belonged in the frame, Charles felt his stomach tighten. That photo had been taken in the gardens of his father's estate. He was in it, and so was Eli Monroe. The name thundered in his mind. Eli was his half-brother, the son of his father's affair with a woman whose name was never spoken in their house. When the scandal broke behind closed doors, Charles had been told simply, "There's another child. He's not yours to know. No one must ever know." Years passed, then decades. Charles had lived by those words, climbed boardrooms, built his image, protected the Whitaker name like a sacred brand. But now that name sat shivering on a park bench, holding onto a photo like it was the only proof he had ever existed. Charles knelt beside the boy, pulled out his phone with a shaky hand, and called for an ambulance. He didn't even know if Eli would survive the night. His skin was like porcelain, his lips tinged blue. Charles looked down again at the photo clutched in frostbitten fingers and felt a pang he couldn't name. The ambulance lights broke the snow-lit silence. As they lifted Eli into the van, Charles found himself walking beside them. He didn't know what he would tell the hospital. He didn't even know if he had the right to be there. But something deeper than legacy, older than denial, had cracked open inside him. And in the echoes of his father's voice, "No one must know," Charles heard something else rising louder now. What happens when silence becomes cruelty? Some people are forgotten, not because they disappeared, but because someone else decided to erase them. Subscribe to Heart Story, because every erased name deserves to be spoken out loud. The hospital hallway pulsed with sterile light and mechanical sounds beeping monitors. Intercom clicks, the rhythmic squeak of nurses' soles on linoleum. Charles Whitaker stood still among it all, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his jaw set. On the other side of the glass, Eli lay motionless beneath a tangle of IV lines and warm blankets, his face soft in unconsciousness, like it had returned to a child's state. There was a band of bruising along one side of his temple and the deep hollowness of hunger resting under both eyes. The nurse had said hypothermia, dehydration, malnutrition, and something else, exhaustion that wasn't physical. She didn't have to explain further. Charles had seen it the moment Eli was lifted from that bench. Some things don't drain from the body overnight. They accumulate one night at a time over years of being unseen. When the intake staff handed him a plastic bag of Eli's belongings, Charles hesitated. Inside were a few wrinkled shirts, a toothbrush missing its cover, a folded paper envelope stuffed with small bills, ones and fives. But beneath it all was something else. A medical bill, paid in cash, dated just last week. The name on the statement wasn't Eli's. It was for a woman, Anna Gray, and handwritten at the bottom was a note, "Don't let them discharge her early. I'll bring more when I can." Charles held the paper like it might burn through his skin. Whoever Anna had been, she had meant something. maybe more than anything. A name not spoken in the history of his family, but scribbled in shaky blue ink, backed by every dollar Eli could gather. While Charles sat in penthouses and boardrooms, Eli had been scraping together change to keep someone else alive. His mind drifted back years and years ago. There had been a summer on the coast when Charles was still a teenager. A boy had appeared in the distance, just beyond the garden hedge. Eli. He must have been around 8. Quiet, watchful, always alone. Charles remembered now how the boy used to sit on a swing set long after the other children had gone home, looking toward the house as if waiting for someone to open the door. He never did. Charles never waved, never spoke. Not because he hated the boy, but because he feared what acknowledging him would cost. Their father had been clear: you protect the name, or you lose it. And Charles had obeyed. He learned to ignore what didn't fit the image, to step over shadows without looking down. He was rewarded for it, applauded, made CEO at 35, sat beside presidents and dignitaries. But now, staring through the glass at a boy whose existence he once denied. Charles couldn't remember a single word from those ceremonies. What echoed instead were the moments he had turned away, the quiet look in Eli's eyes from across the yard, the way he stood still when Charles passed by, as if hope itself might make him visible. But hope only goes so far when no one ever turns around. Later that evening, as a nurse changed Eli's IV, Charles asked to look through the rest of the bag. She handed it over wordlessly. In the bottom, folded inside a worn zippered pouch, was a document, a birth certificate. The paper was thin, the edges curled from years of being carried. But the name was printed clearly: Eli James Monroe, Father Richard Whitaker. Charles's throat tightened. There it was in black and white, undeniable, legal. A line of ink that shattered decades of silence. It struck him then Eli hadn't been carrying it to prove anything to Charles. He wasn't trying to claim wealth or inheritance. He had carried it like a talisman, like a whisper that maybe he mattered to someone once. That somewhere in the world, someone had written his name next to a father's and believed that truth deserved to exist. We often measure family in photographs, bloodlines, and last names. But sometimes it lives in the quiet defiance of a boy who refuses to erase himself, even when everyone else has. And sometimes the deepest form of abandonment isn't forgetting someone exists, it's convincing them they never should have. The car ride from the hospital was silent, broken only by the occasional hum of traffic. Eli sat in the back seat, head leaning against the cold glass, his body still weak from the night spent outside. His eyes held no questions. No trust, no recognition, only exhaustion. When they pulled into the private garage beneath Charles's penthouse, the boy didn't react. He hadn't asked where they were going. He hadn't asked anything at all. Charles led him through the quiet lobby, past polished marble and curated art. Everything gleamed with wealth, but none of it reached the boy's eyes. He followed like a shadow, silent, out of place, shrinking into the corners of the space as if trying not to be seen. The room Charles had prepared was small by penthouse standards, but still larger than most apartments in the city. It had once belonged to his mother. After she passed, he'd left it untouched, sealed behind a door no one entered. Now he opened it again. There was an old velvet chair by the window, a narrow writing desk, faded wallpaper patterned with soft florals. The room smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. This used to be hers, Charles said, his voice low, unsure why he was speaking at all. Eli said nothing. He walked in slowly, not touching anything, until he reached the far wall. There, leaning against a bookcase, was the only bag he'd brought from the hospital. He knelt beside it and unzipped the front. What spilled out were not clothes or belongings, but sketchbooks, dozens of them. Some bent, some missing covers, pages thick with graphite and ink. Charles took a step closer. On the open page was a drawing, his own face rendered in delicate pencil lines, down to the slight crease between his brows, the sharp edge of his jaw, the exact tilt of his expression when he wasn't watching himself in a mirror. the kind of details only someone who had studied him for years could capture. He turned the page. Another sketch. This time, Charles walking through a crowd, then another standing at a podium. Unaware someone was watching from a distance, image after image, always from afar, always through memory. They weren't the drawings of admiration. They were the quiet sketches of someone trying to understand who they shared blood with. A stranger seen only through headlines, glimpsed from behind security guards, imagined in silence. Eli finally spoke. Why didn't anyone ever come for me? His voice was soft, but it carried like thunder in that quiet room. Charles didn't answer. Because the truth that legacy had mattered more than people, that silence was easier than risk felt like a second betrayal. He sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, hands clasped, staring at the carpet. I didn't know how, he said, though even that felt dishonest. He had known. He had just chosen not to. Eli sat on the floor, surrounded by his sketches. He didn't press. He didn't argue. He simply pulled one book closer and began to draw again, lines forming on the page with mechanical rhythm, as if the only way to process the world was through the act of making it visible. In that moment, Charles understood what no boardroom had ever taught him, that silence leaves stains. Not always loud, not always immediate, but deep, long-lasting, passed down in gestures, in the way a boy flinches from kindness, in the absence of a name spoken aloud. He looked at the sketch of himself again and saw something he hadn't noticed before. The eyes weren't harsh. They were searching. And maybe that's what Eli had done all these years, not waited to be rescued, but searched for something that felt like acknowledgement. Not money, not status, just proof that he hadn't been invisible all along. It's easy to believe that not doing harm is the same as doing good. But in families, the harm often lies in what we never say, in the doors we never open, and in the people we refuse to face until it's almost too late. A week passed before Charles brought Eli to the Whitaker building, a glass and steel monolith in the heart of Manhattan, where legacy weighed more than innovation and surnames opened more doors than resumes ever could. The security guards at the front desk didn't question Eli's presence. They didn't dare when Charles walked in beside him, hand lightly resting on the boy's shoulder, guiding him through a place he had once been kept out of by bloodlines and silence. They took the executive elevator to the top floor, past a gallery of portraits showing generations of Whitaker men's stern faces frozen in oil paint, all bearing the same jawline, the same carefully cultivated expressions of power. Charles paused briefly before them. He looked at the faces, then at Eli, who stood quietly, eyes lingering not on the portraits, but on the plaque beneath them that read, Excellence, Tradition, Honor. Charles introduced Eli to the community engagement director, asked that he be placed in a learning program, part mentorship, part exposure to philanthropy. Nothing flashy, no title, no expectation, just a place to begin. Eli didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, accepted the notebook offered to him, and sat quietly in a back room that looked over the skyline. It wasn't much, but it was his first desk, his first badge, his first real space within a family legacy that had long denied his existence. But New York whispers faster than it listens. By the end of the week, someone had taken a photo. Eli, stepping out of Charles's car. Eli, entering the private elevator. Eli, exiting the building with a lanyard bearing the Whitaker insignia. It was uploaded to a staff gossip forum under the caption, The CEO's Charity Case. Then came the questions. Who was the boy? Why was he in the building? Why was he living in Charles's home? And worse rumors, that he was a distant relative, that he was blackmailing Charles, that he was a threat. The boardroom turned cold. The next Monday, Charles walked into a closed-door meeting. Gray suits lined the table, polished shoes tapping under the mahogany. We're concerned, one of the directors began, his tone measured. Public perception matters. Hosting a previously homeless minor under your roof, one claiming to be a Whitaker. He's not claiming. Charles interrupted. He is. Silence fell. One of the older members leaned forward. Charles, with all due respect, this could damage the brand. You've worked decades to build an image of stability, elegance, suddenly revealing an illegitimate sibling. It's messy. He's not messy. Our choices were, that night, Charles returned home to find Eli packing. The sketchbooks were already zipped up. His coat lay folded across the bed. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Eli said simply, I know I don't belong here. Charles didn't speak right away. He looked around the room, the same room he had once closed off to the world, and saw how quickly it had filled with life since Eli stepped into it. How the silence had been broken. How the air no longer smelled like morning, but motion. The next morning, headlines broke. Whitaker heir unveils secret brother Charles Whitaker makes surprise announcement. I failed him once. I won't do it again. The press conference had been brief, direct. Charles stood in front of reporters, cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. Beside him, Eli silent, composed, gaze steady. This is Eli Monroe, Charles had said. He is my brother. And while I cannot undo the past, I can choose how we move forward. There was no PR team involved, no branding strategy, just the truth raw and bare, and a public admission of failure in an industry that worshipped perfection. What followed surprised everyone. Not shame, not collapse, but support. People didn't see scandal. They saw responsibility. They saw a man standing beside the boy once erased by power, now embraced by it. Investors applauded the transparency. Clients admired the courage. And in that moment, Charles finally understood legacy doesn't crumble when you confront the truth. It strengthens, because people don't trust masks. They trust those willing to take them off. Reputation isn't what we protect, it's what we repair. The week after the press conference, something shifted. Eli stood in front of the school registrar's office, a clean folder in his hand, his name Eli James Monroe Whitaker printed in firm letters across the front. The hyphen had been his idea, a quiet bridge between the boy he had been and the family that had once chosen silence. For the first time in his life, he had legal identification, health insurance, and a place to stay that didn't vanish the moment rent was due. He walked through the hallways not as a shadow or a temporary face, but as someone whose name finally belonged on a list on paper, in records, in the world. At home, he no longer kept his sketchbook zipped away. They lined the edge of his desk now, beside freshly sharpened pencils and a small lavender plant Charles had left on the windowsill. No words attached, just a quiet gesture, soft and specific. Eli had said once that lavender reminded him of his mother's scent. Charles had remembered. That Sunday, they drove north. A quiet road cutting through autumn-burnished hills. Eli stared out the window, watching the colors blur. When they pulled into the gravel lot of a small country church, Eli's hand stilled in his lap. She was buried in the far corner of the cemetery. No stone, just a small wooden cross, nearly overtaken by grass. Charles stepped back, letting Eli walk alone. The boy knelt beside the grave, pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat, and tucked it under a smooth river stone. It was a drawing in his mother, holding a younger version of Eli on her lap, a soft smile on her face, her hair drawn in lavender strokes. Charles placed the bouquet beside it. Not roses, not lilies, lavender. They stood in silence, not needing words. Not everything had to be said aloud to be understood. Some grief sits so deep it only answers to presence. Later that month, during the annual shareholder meeting, Charles made one final decision that no board could vote down. The meeting was full. Suits, shareholders, reporters. As always, Charles took the podium with quiet command, but this time, instead of giving closing remarks, he stepped aside. Eli, he said into the mic, you wanted to show them something. The boy stood slowly, walked to the front, carrying nothing but a single sheet of paper. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He held up the drawing, two boys, standing side by side, One in a tailored suit, one in thrift store clothes, both holding the same photo. The room stilled. Then, applause. One by one, they rose. The entire hall, on their feet, not for wealth, not for legacy, but for truth, for courage, for the soft strength of a boy who had survived erasure and still chose to draw others in. Afterward, Charles found Eli backstage, sitting quietly, sketching the folds of a curtain. He didn't look up when Charles approached, but he didn't need to. The silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt shared. Some bonds are forged in blood, others in time. But the strongest ones, they begin in silence, in the spaces between names until someone finally speaks them aloud. And when they do, the healing begins. Have you ever carried a truth so long that saying it out loud felt impossible? What would happen if today you finally did? Tell us in the comments. And subscribe to Heart Story, because every forgotten voice deserves to be heard.